When I first joined Silverline Enterprises, I was nothing more than a quiet assistant, the kind of person nobody really notices in the chaos of a corporate office. My job was simple: organize schedules, prepare reports, and take notes in endless meetings. To most of the staff, I was invisible, but to my boss, Richard Collins, I was a target. Richard loved to make a show of his authority. He thrived on belittling others, especially those who couldn't fight back. And I, Claire Dawson, was his favorite subject of ridicule. In every meeting, he found a way to laugh at me, to mock me, to remind the entire staff that I was just an assistant. "Claire, you don't need to bother with this data," he would sneer, waving a report I had worked late into the night to prepare. "This is grown-up work. Just stick to typing and fetching coffee." The staff would laugh nervously, not because they agreed, but because they didn't dare cross Richard. He was charming to the board, flashy with his presentations, and ruthless behind closed doors. At first, his insults stung. I went home many nights with tears burning in my eyes, wondering why I stayed in a place where I was treated like furniture. But I also knew something Richard didn't. I was good at my job. Better than good, I was observant. And in the quiet corners of the office, away from the noise of his arrogance, I started to notice things. Richard's numbers didn't always add up. He liked to present dazzling charts and flashy forecasts, but behind those slides were gaps, small at first, then bigger. I realized he was manipulating data to impress the investors. He wasn't running the company honestly. He was weaving a house of cards. Of course, I never dared to confront him. If I had, he would have laughed me out of the building. So instead, I did what I knew best. I kept quiet, and I wrote everything down. Every inconsistency, every altered figure, every detail he brushed aside. My notes became more than just reminders. They became a secret ledger of the truth. Weeks turned into months. The pattern grew clearer. Richard was living for the applause, chasing short-term wins to keep his image polished. But the more he faked, the more fragile Silverline became. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. And strangely, he didn't see it. He was too busy mocking me, too blind to realize the assistant he laughed at was the only one keeping track of reality. One Monday morning, Richard made his biggest spectacle yet. The entire team was gathered in the conference room. Investors were visiting the office later that week, and he was rehearsing his grand pitch. He strutted around the room with his usual arrogance, pointing at the glossy slides projected on the wall. "These numbers," he declared, "are proof that Silverline is entering a golden era. Profits are soaring, investors are thrilled, and our competitors are scrambling to keep up." I sat quietly in the corner, my notepad open, writing down every claim he made. I already knew the truth. The profits weren't soaring, they were slipping. Investors weren't thrilled, they were cautious. And our competitors weren't scrambling, they were steady. Then, right in the middle of his performance, Richard turned to me. "Claire," he said with a grin that made my stomach twist, "why don't you explain these figures to the team?" "Oh wait, you wouldn't understand them, would you? After all, you're just here to make coffee." The room erupted in nervous laughter. My face burned, but I didn't speak. I simply nodded, lowered my eyes, and kept writing. What Richard didn't realize was that in his eagerness to humiliate me, he gave me the perfect chance to record his exact words. Another entry in my growing book of evidence. After the meeting, as everyone filed out, I lingered behind. Richard, smug as ever, patted me on the shoulder. "Don't take it personally, Claire," he said, smirking. "This is the big leagues. People like you're just background noise." Background noise. That was all I was to him. But I knew better. I knew the cracks in his empire, and I knew that one day, all the background noise would turn into the loudest truth he could not silence. That evening, I stayed late at the office, long after the lights dimmed and the hallways emptied. I opened my drawer and pulled out the folder where I kept my notes. Page after page of figures, quotes, copies of memos, screenshots of emails Richard thought no one paid attention to. My hands shook as I flipped through them, not from fear anymore, but from certainty. Richard Collins believed I was powerless, but I was holding the power he didn't even know existed, and the day would come when he would regret every insult, every mocking laugh, every word that cut me down in front of others. Because while Richard was busy putting on a show for the world, I was quietly building the truth. And the truth, sooner or later, always demands to be heard. The office was silent that night, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Only the hum of the air conditioner filled the room as I spread my notes across the desk. Each page told a story Richard thought he had buried. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the folder, and whispered to myself, "One day." But that one day came sooner than I expected. 2 mornings later, Richard summoned the entire department to the conference room. His smile was wider than ever, the kind of smile that meant trouble. "Great news, everyone," he announced, pacing like a performer on stage. "We've secured a private dinner with 2 of our biggest investors. They'll be visiting the office this Friday. This is our moment to shine." The staff clapped politely. Richard thrived on these moments, being the center of attention, painting grand illusions. But then his eyes landed on me. "And Claire," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You'll be there too. To take notes, of course. Don't worry, we won't make you say anything complicated." The room chuckled. I felt the familiar burn in my cheeks but stayed silent. Inside, though, I wasn't burning with shame anymore. I was burning with resolve, because I knew if Richard repeated those lies in front of investors, it wouldn't just be my humiliation at stake. It would be the entire company. That week passed in a blur of tension. Richard rehearsed his pitch again and again, each time exaggerating the numbers more, polishing the fantasy further. The staff knew something was off. They whispered in hallways, exchanged uneasy glances, but nobody dared challenge him. He was the boss, and bosses don't like to be questioned. On Thursday night, I made my move. Long after Richard left the office, I accessed the shared system where all reports were stored. My heart pounded as I pulled copies of the unaltered financial statements and matched them against the versions Richard planned to present. The differences were staggering. Losses turned into gains. Declines twisted into growth. Red ink magically transformed into green. I saved everything: screenshots, backup files, timestamps, proof. My folder grew heavier, but my heart felt lighter. Friday evening arrived. The investors walked in, sharp suits and sharper eyes. They were greeted with champagne and Richard's dazzling charm. He led them to the polished conference room, where a massive screen displayed his presentation. Staff members filled the seats, some eager, some nervous. I sat at the far corner with my notepad, my silent role in the background. Richard began. His voice boomed with confidence as he clicked through slide after slide of record profits and unprecedented growth. He joked, he laughed, he spun his story like a master illusionist. The investors nodded, impressed. For a moment, I almost believed he might pull it off. But then came the numbers. "Here," Richard declared, pointing to a chart that showed profits skyrocketing, "is proof that Silverline has outpaced every competitor in the last quarter." I glanced down at my folder, where the real chart told the opposite story. Profits had fallen, competitors were ahead, and Silverline was hanging by a thread. One of the investors leaned forward. "That's impressive, Richard. But may we see the raw data behind these projections?" A flicker of unease crossed Richard's face. He covered it quickly with a laugh. Of course. "Claire, be a dear and bring up the files, would you?" The room turned to me. My heart stopped. He hadn't expected me to do more than take notes, but now he had thrown the spotlight directly in my lap. I stood slowly, clutching my folder. My hands trembled, but not with fear, with opportunity. I walked to the front of the room, Richard watching me with a smirk, confident I would freeze or fumble. Instead, I opened the system and displayed the financials, the real ones. Gasps filled the room as the investors leaned forward, scanning the numbers. "These are the actual reports from our database," I said, my voice steady. "As you can see, the figures differ from the presentation." Richard's smile vanished. His face drained of color. "Claire," he stammered, "those files are outdated." She must have pulled the wrong, but one of the investors cut him off. "The timestamps show these are the most recent entries." "Richard, why are they so different from your slides?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Richard, who suddenly looked small in his own kingdom. He tried to laugh it off, to spin another lie, but the investors weren't buying it. I stepped back, letting the weight of truth settle in the room. For once, I didn't need to argue. The numbers spoke louder than anything. After the meeting, chaos erupted. Richard stormed into his office, slamming doors, shouting at staff. I quietly returned to my desk, slipping my folder back into the drawer. My colleagues passed me uneasy glances, some grateful, some afraid. Nobody said a word, but I could feel the shift. For the first time, I wasn't just the assistant. I was the one who had shown the cracks in the empire. That night, as I packed my bag, Richard appeared in the doorway. His face was red, his jaw tight. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed, undermining me in front of investors. "Don't forget your place, Claire. You're nothing without me." I met his glare, my hand steady on the strap of my bag. "I didn't undermine you, Richard. I showed the truth, and the truth doesn't need your approval." For a moment, he looked like he might explode, but then he forced a laugh, the hollow kind. "We'll see, Claire. We'll see." As I walked out of the building, the night air felt colder, sharper, but also freer. Richard thought he still had control. He thought he could scare me back into silence. But deep down, I knew the balance had shifted. The investors had seen the cracks. The staff had seen his mask slip. And I still had more proof than he could ever cover up. The storm had only just begun. The Monday after the disastrous investor meeting, the atmosphere inside Silverline Enterprises had shifted. The once lively corridors now felt heavy, like everyone was waiting for something to break. Richard's booming laughter, which used to echo from his office, was gone. In its place were slamming doors, frantic phone calls, and whispered conversations. I walked through the office with my usual calm, my notebook tucked under my arm. But this time eyes followed me. Some of my colleagues nodded subtly, a silent acknowledgement of what had happened on Friday. Others avoided my gaze, too afraid to be associated with me, afraid Richard would notice. Richard did notice. By noon, he called me into his office. The blinds were drawn, his suit jacket hung carelessly on the chair, and his tie was loose. He didn't look like the confident man who strutted in front of investors just days ago. He looked cornered. "Close the door," he ordered. I did as he said, then stood quietly by the desk. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You embarrassed me," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Do you understand what you've done? Those investors are rattled. The board is questioning me. All because you couldn't keep your mouth shut." I kept my face steady. "I didn't embarrass you, Richard. The numbers did." His eyes flared. He slammed his fist against the desk, making a stack of papers jump. "Don't get smart with me, Claire. I made you. I let you sit in meetings. I gave you exposure. And this is how you repay me. By stabbing me in the back?" I almost laughed. Exposure? All he had given me were insults. But I didn't show it. I just met his glare calmly. "I only showed the truth. If the truth damages you, that's not on me." For a moment, he seemed ready to fire me on the spot, but then something flickered in his expression, fear. He knew if he threw me out too quickly, it might raise more questions. So instead, he leaned back, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're clever," he said slowly, "but you're still just an assistant. Don't forget that. Assistants are replaceable." He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, but I left knowing I had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The next few days were chaos. The board demanded explanations. Investors wanted updates. Richard scrambled to patch his presentation with half-truths and excuses. He blamed technical errors, miscommunications, even clerical mistakes. But the trust he had enjoyed was slipping. And through it all, I kept working quietly, gathering more. Late nights at the office became my routine. I combed through emails, cross-checked financial statements, and saved backup after backup. Every discovery was another crack in Richard's facade. But Richard wasn't sitting idle either. One afternoon, I overheard him speaking sharply on the phone in his office. "She's just an assistant," he hissed. "She doesn't matter. I'll handle it. Trust me, she won't be a problem." A chill ran down my spine. He was talking about me. That evening, as I packed my bag, one of my colleagues, Evelyn from accounting, approached me. She glanced around nervously before whispering, Be careful, Claire. Richard's furious. He's looking for a way to pin this on you. I frowned. On me? Evelyn nodded. He's already hinting that you mishandled the reports. That maybe you're the one who confused the data. He wants to make you the scapegoat. The words hit me like ice water. Of course. Richard couldn't admit his lies, so he'd find someone weaker to blame. And who better than the assistant he'd always mocked? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying every insult, every smirk, every time he'd called me useless. Now he wanted to twist the truth so that his downfall would become my fault. But I wasn't powerless anymore. I had proof. The next morning I came prepared. I arrived early, loaded my USB drive with every file I had collected, and slipped it into my bag. No matter what Richard tried, he couldn't erase what I had. Later that day, the board called an emergency session. The directors sat around the long mahogany table, tension thick in the air. Richard stood at the front trying to spin another story. There have been some discrepancies in our reports, he said smoothly. But I assure you, the mistakes are being corrected. Unfortunately, some of this confusion stems from clerical mishandling of files by staff. His eyes flicked to me. I felt the entire room's gaze follow. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. Are you suggesting your assistant is responsible? One of the directors asked. Richard spread his hands innocently. I don't like to point fingers, but sometimes when inexperienced staff handle sensitive data, errors happen. Claire is hardworking, but she may have misunderstood some... Excuse me, I said, standing. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly. With all due respect, that's not true. The room went silent. Directors turned, surprised that the quiet assistant had spoken. Richard's jaw tightened. I pulled out my folder and laid it on the table. Page after page of notes, printed emails, side-by-side reports. I've been documenting every change to these numbers for months. None of this was clerical error. It was deliberate. Gasps rippled through the board. One director leaned forward, scanning the documents. These are serious allegations. Richard's face flushed red. This is nonsense. She's lying. She's twisting things to make herself look important. But another director interrupted. The timestamps match. These reports are authentic. Richard, can you explain this? For the first time, Richard had no words. He opened his mouth, closed it, then glared at me with pure hatred. I didn't flinch. I stood tall, meeting the board's eyes instead of his. I may just be an assistant, I said, but I know numbers. And numbers don't lie. People do. The room fell into a tense silence. The board exchanged looks. Richard tried to laugh it off, but his charm was gone, stripped away by the weight of the evidence. When the meeting ended, whispers filled the hallways. Staff members glanced at me with wide eyes. Some smiled faintly. Others simply looked relieved that someone had finally spoken up. Richard stormed past me without a word, his fists clenched. I knew this wasn't over. He wouldn't give up easily. But I also knew I wasn't afraid anymore. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't just in my folder. It was out in the open, and Richard Collins's empire was starting to crumble. After the explosive board meeting, the entire office felt like it was holding its breath. Rumors spread quickly, directors questioning Richard's future, investors demanding answers, and staff whispering that Silverline's golden era might be crashing down. For once my name was on everyone's lips, not as a joke or an afterthought, but as the assistant who dared to challenge the boss. Richard, however, wasn't finished. For days he stormed around the office like a wounded animal, snapping at employees, blaming departments, rewriting emails late into the night. He avoided me whenever possible, but I could feel his hatred in every glance. He wanted revenge. Then came Friday morning. An emergency announcement summoned the entire company to the main hall. Staff poured in, uneasy, murmuring about what it could be. I sat near the back, my folder tucked under my arm as always. Richard stepped onto the stage, his suit crisp, his smile forced. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to address the recent misunderstandings. Some individuals have tried to tarnish Silverline's reputation with baseless claims and falsified documents." His eyes scanned the room and locked on me. My stomach tightened. Here it was, the final attack. These lies, he continued, have caused unnecessary panic. But I assure you, I have spoken with the board, and we are stronger than ever. As for those responsible for this distraction, they will be dealt with. Gasps rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to me. Richard had just painted a target on my back in front of the entire company. I rose slowly, my legs steady even though my heart pounded. "If you're talking about me, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs, "then let's put everything on the table, right here, right now." The room went silent. Richard's smirk faltered. "This isn't the time, Claire." "It's the perfect time," I replied. I walked toward the stage, pulling the USB drive from my bag. Because the truth doesn't wait for your schedule. With trembling fingers, I plugged the drive into the projector. The screen behind Richard lit up, not with his polished slides, but with side-by-side comparisons of his doctored numbers and the real reports. The staff gasped. Directors who had joined the meeting sat forward in their chairs. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is what Richard has been showing you." I clicked to the next slide. And this is the truth. Losses where he claimed gains. Declines where he promised growth. Every lie laid bare in front of the very people he had fooled. The room erupted. Whispers turned into outrage. Some employees looked betrayed. Others looked relieved, finally seeing proof of what they had suspected all along. Richard tried to speak, but his voice cracked. This is sabotage! She's manipulating these files." But one of the board members stood up. "Enough, Richard. We've verified these documents ourselves. Claire's evidence is solid. You've misled this company and you've misled us." Richard's face turned pale. His hands gripped the podium like it was the only thing holding him upright. Security moved forward. The board member's voice was firm. "Richard Collins, you're suspended effective immediately pending investigation." The staff gasped again. Richard's empire, the one he had built on arrogance and deception, collapsed in front of everyone's eyes. He glared at me one last time, his expression a twisted mix of rage and disbelief, before security escorted him out. Silence hung heavy in the room. Then slowly people began to clap. First a few, then more, until the hall filled with thunderous applause. Not for Richard. For the truth, I stood frozen, overwhelmed. For so long I had been invisible, mocked, treated like nothing. And now, the very people who once laughed at me were looking at me with respect, with gratitude. After the meeting, employees gathered around. Evelyn hugged me. "You saved this company," she whispered. Others shook my hand, thanked me for having the courage they didn't. That night, as I left the office, I looked up at the Silver Line logo glowing against the dark sky. For the first time, I didn't feel small standing beneath it. I felt powerful, not because I had destroyed Richard, but because I had proven that even someone overlooked, someone underestimated, could change everything. The truth had won. And I, just the assistant, was the one who held the pen that wrote the ending. If this story kept you hooked till the very end, then you already know one thing. The truth always wins, no matter how much power or lies try to bury it. And just like Claire's journey, we've got more powerful, emotional, and inspiring stories waiting for you. So don't miss out. Subscribe to my YouTube channel right now and join me for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, because every story has a lesson, and the next one might just change the way you see the world.